Today's daf is daf Lamed, and we'll begin around 6 lines down from the top. And the Gemara starts by quoting the Mishnah on daf Chavav, Erev Tisha B'Av, Lo Yochal Adam Shnei Tavshilin. And the Mishnah continues and says, Lo Yochal Basar V'Lo Yishte Yain. So on Erev Tisha B'Av, we have a double prohibition. Number one, we're not allowed to eat 2 cooked foods, nor are we allowed to eat meat or wine. Omer Rav Yehuda lo shanu ela mishei shos ulamala. The Isur on Erev Tisha B'Av that we mentioned here in the Mishnah only applies from midday and on. Al mishei shos ulamata, but from midday up. Lamata here means up, meaning towards the morning, mutter. So the first half of the day is mutter, and the Isur only is chal in the second half of the day. You're close enough to Tisha B'Av that you have to begin the avelus of Tisha B'Av for the Churban Abayis. This halacha that from midday and on, meaning in the second half of the day, we have these prohibitions. That only applies el besuda mafsik ba. That means the very last suda. He could have 2 suudos in that afternoon, and there are no restrictions regarding the first of those 2 sudas. It only applies to the last of the suda. Suda she'ena mafsik ba mutter. V'travayu. Now we have 2 statements of Rabbi Yehuda, and they are both lekula, meaning that these isurim will only apply if you can check off 2 conditions. And the Gemara is going to go through the logic that if we only had one of these dinim, we would not know the other din. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda told us these 2 dinim in order to be mekil. Tzricha, diashmeinon b'suda mafsik ba. If he would have just told us that in the last suit of the day, you have these isurim, how about me? I would say that afilu mishei shel salmata, even if it's his last suit is in the morning. Kamash malan. That's why he tells me the second din of mishei shos ulamala. It's only asur in the afternoon. So that if he eats his last suda in the morning, no restrictions. And if he would have told me the other din, that it depends on afternoon, midday, and on. Mishei shos ulamala havamina filu besuda sheinu mafsikba. I would have assumed that there's an that there's an automatic all-inclusive prohibition in the second half of the day, and kamash malon, no, it's only b'suda mafsik. So you need 2 conditions in order to generate this prohibition. It's got to be a suda mafsekes, and it has to be mishei shos ulamal. Tanya kavot. So we have one brisa that's going to support the kula, that it's got to be in the afternoon, and another brisa that's going to support the kula, that it only applies to the last suda that he's eating. Tanya kavase kilishna basra hasoed erev Tisha B'Av im asid lisod suda cheres. If he has an intention to eat another suda, this is not his last suda, mutar lechel, he can eat within that suda basar and lishtos yain. Because since he intends to have another suda, this is not a suda mafsekes. V'im lav. But if his intention is that this is going to be his very last suda, asur lechel basar v'lishtos yain. So we see from this brisa that the Isur only applies to the Suda Mafsekes. Now we're going to quote another brisa, which complements the first brisa and adds the other condition. Tanya Kalishna Kama, Erev Tisha B'Av Lo Yochal Adam Shnei Tavshilin, Lo Yochal Basa V'Lo Yishte Yain. Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer Yeshana. According to Rav Shimon Gamliel, there's not an absolute Isur prohibiting Shnei Tavshilin or Achilas Basar and shtiyas yain. It all depends on what you're used to. You just change and you diminish that which you're used to. Rabbi Yehuda, Kate said Mishana, what does Rav Shimon Gamliel have in mind? Number one, here's an example. If he usually eats 2 cooked foods in his meal, Yochal min echad, he should limit himself to one cooked food. Imay ragil lisod asar b'nei adam, if he eats in a group, a large group of 10 people, soed b'chamisha, he should cut it down by half. And that's what we call miut kvodo. In other words, you diminish the honor of this meal. Im hayaragil lishtos asara kosos, if he drinks 10 cups, I guess, of wine, shosa chamisha kosos, he should cut it by half. Then the Brisa says, when does this Easter apply? On Erev Tishba, that's only Mishei Shos Ulamala. Aval Mishei Shos Ulamat, in the first half of the day, then Mutter. The Brisa clearly indicates that the Easter only applies to the second half of Erev Tishba. So number one, we have one Brisa that says that he's got to change his hergel, and if he's used to eating 2 tafshil, for example, only one, he'll cut down the number of kosas of yayin and the number of people that he's eating with. And now we have the other brisa that says that it's only applicable mishei shos ulamal, the second half of the day. Anya idach, now we have another brisa. Erev Tisha B'Av lo yochal adam shnei tafshin lo yochal bas lo yishta yayin divrei Rabbi Meir. And it's interesting, Rabbi Meir in this brisa doesn't qualify. He uses the term Erev Tisha B'Av, which might imply that according to Rabbi Meir, the Easter of basar and yayin and shnei tafshin applies the entire day of Erev Tisha B'Av. It's not clear. Chacham omrim yishana, as we said earlier, it's not an absolute Easter, but rather he requires to cut it down. If he's used to eating 2 tafshilin, then he eats 1 tafshil. Memait b'basar yayin keitzad. Memait, how does he cut it down? Litra basar, he eats a very large volume of meat. Yochel chatzi litra, you cut it down by half. He should cut down the volume of wine by half. If he's a person who never eats meat and never drinks wine, let's say he's a poor person, kolikar, then also he should be prohibited. He should avoid any eating of basar, any drinking of yain at all in the Suda Mafsekes. Now Reb Shimon Gamliel is introducing another element, and that is a food that, let's say, was salted, or it's very sharp, very bitter. And generally speaking, when we talk about moliach, we mean fish or meat that was salted for a long period of time, like 3 days, 72 hours. And then it loses its time. It doesn't have any longer a time of basa. Anya idach, another brisa. All shuhu mishum tichamav. In other words, the Suda Mafsekes, which is a Suda mishum tichamav. Also lechol basa basa lichlas yain. The asur lirchol. So now the brisa introduces the isur achita, and that applies during the time of that Suda Mafsekes and beyond. But if this is not a Suda Mafsekes, or for example, other fast days, right? We have Shavas B'Tammuz, and we have Tzom Gedalia, we have Asar B'Teves. These are not fast days that require a Suda Mafsekes. We begin the fast in the morning. It's then Mutal Lechol Basar Lichtos Yayin, Umutal Lirchos. These Isurim don't apply to other fast days. That's why you can actually have a Bar Mitzvah Suda on the night of Shavasa B'Tammuz. I once attended such a
Really?
Mutal Lechol Basar Lichtos Yayin, Umutal Lirchos. Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi Omer Mishum Aviv Kol Shoshen Mutal Lechol Mutal Lirchos. Even in the Suda Mafsekes of Tisha B'Av, he's allowed to bathe because he would be allowed to eat any food stuff other than meat. And as long as the Taanit hasn't begun yet, and he's not enjoined from and obligated to fast, there's no Isur Achitza. In other words, according to Rabbi Yishmael, the Isur Achitza sets in with the Taanit, not before the Taanit. It's not like the case of Seudah. Tanrabanon. Now the Bryce is going to compare the laws of Tisha B'Av to the laws of Avelus. If some Rahman al loses one of his close relatives, all mitzvahs and nogos be Avel, nogos be Tisha B'Av. So here we have a distinction between two categories of Avelus. One category of Avelus is called Avelus Chadasha, a brand new Avelus for someone who just died, a relative. And then we have Avelus Yeshana, old Avelus for what happened thousands of years ago at the time of the Churban Abayis. And when it says here that Hamitzvos HaNogos be Avel, Nogos be Tisha B'Av, then we're talking about Avelus Yeshana that's being equated with Avelus Chadash. However, there's one difference. With regard to Avelus Yeshana, for Tisha B'Av, Asur B'Achilu Chesiyah, we have an Iser Achila Chesiyah, meaning a Chiyuv Tainus, to fast, and this does not apply to Avelus. When Avel is allowed to eat, he's allowed to drink. But the balance of what's listed here is common to both Avelus Chadash and Avelus Yeshana. That means Besicha, there's another gear who starts with Berachitza, Besicha, Benilas Asando, B'Tashamita. It means that all the afflictions apply to Avelus Yeshana and Avelus Chadash. And there's another common Isur that applies to both these categories of Avelus, and that is Talmud Torah. Also, Likros B'Torah, B'Neviim, U'Beksuvim, V'Lishnos B'Mishnah, B'Talmud, B'Medrash, B'Halachas, U'Ba'Agados. And this is based on a principle the Gemara is about to derive from a pasuk, Ikudi Hashem Yesharim Esamchei Lev, that the study of Torah is an act of simcha, and it's antithetical to Avelus. Avelus is not a proper time for simcha. And this Isur applies both to Torah Shebechsav, like Tanakh, and Torah Shebal Peh, like Mishnah, Talmud, etc. However, there is a heter. This is very interesting. You're allowed to study Torah. Aval korehu b'makom she'eina ragil likros. V'shona b'makom she'eina ragil lishnos. If it's something that's brand new to him, he's never studied anything of the sort. It's new mikros and new mishnayos. He hasn't seen it since he was an embryo in his mother's womb. Then it's a tsar. It's very difficult for a person to learn something the first time around. And then he doesn't get the simcha, and therefore it's not antithetical to Avelus. Now we go on, and we list parts of the Torah that instead of bringing us to a state of simcha, they bring us to a state of tsa'ar. Kore bekinas. Kinas is another name for Megillas Eicha. We use the word kinas for something else. But back in the time of the Shas, kinos was a reference to Megillas Eicha. You're allowed to read Eicha on Tisha B'Av. The Eov, you're allowed to study Eov. Eov is a very sad chapter in Tanakh. It's all about the terrible ro'os that befell Eov, and it's all about doing tshuva. That's not antithetical to the spirit of Avelus Yeshana. Ubidvarim arayim shebiyirmiyah, and he's allowed to learn those prophecies of Yirmiyah that foretell evil and exile. And all these limudim that we said before bring a person to a state of tsar. Now, I'm not sure if the Gemara means here that you're allowed to learn them or that you're obligated to learn them, meaning that you get a mitzvah for learning them. That's my humble opinion, would be that it's not that because of tsar is a license and it's the exception to the rule of Isur Talmud Torah, but moreover, you're makayim a mitzvah of Avelus by reading these things. Tinoko shebeis rabba b'telim, the young children will not go to school, to cheder, and the reason for that is mishum shenema, the Torah says in Tilim Yutes, bikudei Hashem yisharim esamchei lev, and since the study of the law of the Torah brings a person to joy, therefore he's not allowed to be sameach on Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af ino korei b'makom she'eino ragil likros. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there's an absolute prohibition against Torah that applies even to new Torah that he's never learned before. He doesn't allow that license of tsar when it's the first time around. Because ultimately, if he cracks the sugya and he figures it out, it will bring him to simcha, even though it's the first time he's ever seen it. But Rabbi Yehuda agrees to Tanakama that he's allowed to read Eov, Kinnis, Ram, Chabi Yirmiyah, V'tignok Sheikh Beis Rabban, B'Telim, Mishum Shenemar, Pikuri Hashem Yisharim, Misamche Le. The Mishnah tells us about Erev Tisha B'Av, Lo Yochal Basar, Lo Yishta Yayin, and all this applies to the Suda Mafsekes. Tana, we learned in the Brayso, Aval Ochalu Basar Moliach, he's allowed to eat meat that's soaked in salt. Because as we said earlier, the taste of this meat is what we call nifsal. It's no longer the taste of meat. And there's no simcha in eating salted meat. And the Gemara is going to ask, how long did you salt it until it gets that status that you're allowed to eat it on at the Suda Mafsekes? Shosa yayin nigito. Gito means that when they crushed the grapes and the grape juice came out of the grapes, it has a very sharp taste, and it even is mazik. It affects his his bowel movements and so forth. It's something that's not good. We want older wine, and again we'll have to see what makes wine older wine, and how long can you say it's still yayin gito. So first we'll talk about basar moliach. Basar moliach had kama. This is a pretty fascinating analogy. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Chinina Bar Kahana Mishmei Dishmuel Kolzman Chuhu Kishlomim. The law is that a carbon shlomim, which is eaten even lebailim, once 2 days go by. 2 days means Shnei Yomim V'Laila Beinehem. So you have the day of the Hakrava, the night following, and the following day. And those periods of time, those 3 periods of time, create a stretch of time in which you're allowed to eat carbon shlomim. However, after that period of time, then it's already considered nifsal. It actually has the status of nosar. You're not allowed to eat that. Here too, with regard to basar, which is prohibited during the Suda Mafsekes, we're going to say that if the meat was soaking in salt for a period of time of 2 days and 1 night, then the original tam of basar is gone. Instead, he has this tam of moliach, a very salty substance, and he's allowed to eat it during the Suda Mafsekes. So when the Gemara clarifies this iser by using the term kishlomim, because in carbon shlomim, the Torah says, "Hanosar mibsar hazevach b'yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref," meaning nosar is no longer called basar. It was basar, now it's nosar basar, and it loses its status as basar and has to be burned when we get to the 3rd day, which would mean the night after the 2nd day is already into the 3rd day. So that after we get into the 3rd day, it's no longer considered basar. It's changed its status to nosar, and that has implications not only in kachim but also with regard to the iser of basar b'suda mafsekes. So again, the final summary, the bottom line is that if you take meat and you soak it for 2 days and 1 night in between, then you'd be allowed to eat that meat at the Suda Mafsekes. It's a very salty meat, and it's nifsad botam. Yayin migito ad kama. At what point do I say that the yayin is settled down, it's already drinkable, and there's no hezek if I drink this new wine? Calls manshu toseks. As long as it's bubbling, just like you have hot water that bubbles, wine initially bubbles until it settles down. Tana, yayin toses einbo mishum gilui, and the Gemara makes an equation to the law of a nachach. What it is if you leave wine exposed without closing it, then we're afraid that maybe the nachach put his eres, his poison, his toxin into the wine, and therefore mishum sakana, because of that, the danger, you're not allowed to drink that wine. However, if it's odo toses, if this is brand new wine straight out of the gat, out of the press, then the nachash would run away from it because it's risichasa. And kamatisisaso, how long does wine bubble? And therefore it would be permitted even as far as gilui and as far as drinking it at the Sudam Masechet, Shlosha Yomi. So from the time of the pressing of the grapes, if 3 days have passed by, then it's awesome. Then it's full-fledged yain. Now the Gemara presents the Hanhaga of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai on the Suda of Erev Tisha B'Av. And this was his minhag.